Good morning, good afternoon, and many thanks to all of you for tuning in. On behalf of the Centre for Global Development and ODI, we are very excited to see you all here and very much looking forward to our discussion. My name is Helen Webster, a Policy Fellow here at CGD, and I wanted to kick off today's event by outlining a little bit of the work that we've been doing with ODI over the last year, looking into migration and the future of care. So if you could please bring up the presentation, that would be great. Amazing. Next slide, please. Great. So I wanted to quickly start by outlining a little bit of the background to the paper, so why we wrote it in the first place. So the paper was produced by two think tanks, CGD and ODI. We are both independent and global institutes that produce research focused on development issues, including migration, gender equality, and health. And for a long time now, we've been discussing the role that migrants play in the care sector and the role they will increasingly need to play as high-income countries age. Yet we felt that little attention was being paid to this issue, whether at the international or national levels, despite it being an issue shared by the majority of high-income countries. Therefore, we sought to explore this relationship, especially in the context of COVID-19 and health workforce shortages, to provide recommendations to international and national actors about how to ethically and sustainably expand care worker migration. Now, our paper benefited hugely from all the work done by all of the people on our panel today, as well as many more, and we would like to profusely thank them for all of their contributions and suggestions. So my presentation today will focus on our paper's 4 key findings, but I would note that there is a lot more in the report, and I would very much urge you to read and get in touch with your thoughts. Next slide, please. So finding number 1, unsurprisingly, there is an increasing demand for care and large care worker shortages. So we know that as people age, many find themselves in need of dedicated long-term care, and that demand for this care is rapidly increasing. Countries like the Republic of Korea, Japan, Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Singapore, and Germany are forecast to have more than 30% of their population aged 65 and over by the year 2050. These people are also more likely to need care, especially with increased rates of dementia and other complex conditions. But this demand for care is outstripping the supply of care workers. Keeping the current ratio of long-term care workers to older people would mean increasing the number of workers across the OECD by 13.5 million people in the next 18 years. These shortages are much bigger than those in the health sector, though receive far less attention. Why is this? Well, so we know that the sector is undervalued, linked to the feminization of care employment, and largely unattractive. Across the OECD, care workers are paid around the minimum wage and significantly less than similar occupations in other settings. More precarious forms of employment, like 0-hour contracts and in-home work, are also on the rise. This is partly because of a move away from institutional care, given its high cost and older persons' preferences, to providing care in the home. But all of this means that large gaps in the supply of care workers seem likely to persist in the coming decades. Next slide, please. So key message number 2, migrants are essential to the care sector, but do face large issues. So we know that migrants are essential to the delivery of care in many high-income countries, often filling gaps left by inadequate formal care systems. We know that more than 1/5 of the long-term care workforce in OECD countries is foreign-born, and this honestly is likely an understatement, given large informal care workforces in these countries. Most of these migrant care workers are women in midlife from low and middle-income countries. Their intersectionality, including gender, place of origin, and status, make it even more difficult for them to access and bargain for quality work. These migrants are frequently overqualified for their roles and more highly skilled than the local workforce. Now, we know that in countries of destination, these migrant workers can reduce labour shortages and improve the well-being of older people. They could also receive higher wages than they may get at home and send home remittances. But we also know that they're more likely than local workers to encounter low pay and poor working conditions. Workers who are undocumented are even more likely to face these issues. Yet despite this, very few countries actively monitor workforce conditions in the care industry and try to do something about them. Next slide, please. Number 3, there are a few examples of migration pathways in the care sector. So most migrants in the older persons care sector were attracted through migration routes like free movement agreements, family, humanitarian, and student migration. While these systems have provided much needed workers, they've also contributed to a large informal care market in some countries. Only a few OECD countries, like Canada, Israel, and Japan, have created targeted labour immigration pathways for care workers. Both Australia and the UK are discussing this at present, and we anticipate other countries to do so in the future. So while some countries focusing on workforce shortages do look to immigration, some actually exclude immigration as a solution and only look at pay and working conditions in a bid to increase worker supply. But we know that when expanding care work migration pathways, it's worth paying attention to crucial design issues. If migrants are required to live in with their employer or be tied to them, it can increase the risk of exploitation. Many of these migration pathways also preclude family accompaniment, which can lead to care drain back home. Next slide, please. So the last slide sort of talks through what the future should look like. The need to expand ethical and sustainable recruitment within the care sector. We argue that given the large need in high-income countries, such migration is needed now and will increasingly be needed in the future. Any recruitment needs to be in line with the World Health Organization's Global Code of Practice. Care workers are included in the WHO's definition of health workers, but as we've previously discussed, they've received far less attention than health workers. This code requires that any care work migration needs to have a tangible benefit for the country of origin. This could include improving health systems and workforces, while also seeking to strengthen their care systems for future need. Our analysis shows that many countries of origin are actually only about 20 or 30 years behind countries of destination in their aging trends. And finally, obviously, expanding care work migration has to be done alongside improving the sector to also make it more attractive to local workers. Last slide. So based on all of this, our paper has 6 key recommendations. So number 1, make it easier for older persons care workers to migrate through both general migration schemes and targeted pilots. These migration pathways could provide either long-term temporary visas with a view to encourage circularity and skill building, or a pathway to permanent residency and citizenship. Secondly, ensure that migration pathways provide a tangible benefit to the country of origin. Within bilateral government-to-government agreements, financial and technical assistance can be provided to address immediate priorities and could, if well targeted, contribute to the establishment of sustainable and comprehensive long-term care systems in these countries of origin. Thirdly, ensure that visas are not tied to one employer and allow for family accompaniment. Migrant workers should not be expected to leave their families at home, nor risk exploitation and abuse when they leave. Fourthly, ensure that migrant care workers benefit from the same range of entitlements as non-migrant care workers, including full labour and social protections. Creating dedicated agencies to monitor home-based working conditions is probably going to be necessary to help deliver improvements in this area. Fifthly, strengthen qualification recognition and ensure harmonization with countries of origin. So recognized qualifications and career enhancement pathways are essential for the professionalization and improvement of the older person's care workforce. These systems must also ensure that migrants can have their skills recognized and can easily pursue work in the older person's care sector, whether at home or abroad. And finally, gather data on the older person's care workforce and publish it regularly. This should include disaggregated information on the workforce, including things like gender, age, country of origin, and qualifications, and on things like turnover, retention, vacancies, and contract types. These efforts can inform the balance between local and international recruitment and help support workforce development strategies. So that brings me to the end of my presentation today. I really hope that you found it interesting and useful and that it set us up well for a really interesting conversation. I'm personally very excited for the panel and to hear from all of you with your suggestions about how we can take some of these recommendations forward. I would definitely encourage you to read the paper for more information. But for now, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Megan, who's going to be moderating our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. And we'll just echo your call for those who are interested in digging in and learning more from the data, analysis, and recommendations reflected in the report. We'll make sure that there are links available to you in the chat, both to the full report and to the executive summary and shorter summary blog that we did for those who don't want to necessarily go page by page through the whole thing. But for now, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speakers, our panelists, who will be serving the rest of today's discussion. With us, we have Ana Llena-Nozal, who is a senior economist at the OECD, Mariam Bhatti, who is a co-founder, coach, and leader with the Great Care Co-op, Robert Espinoza, who is Vice President of Policy at PHI, and last but not least, Dr. Ito Peng, who is Director of the Center for Global Social Policy at the University of Toronto. Welcome to you all. Before I fire questions at each of you, I just want to recognize our audience today who is joining us virtually. There will be some time at the end of today's discussion to take your questions and comments. So for those of you who are tuning in, please do drop those into the comment section on YouTube, tweet at us at CGDev, or email us at events@cgdev.org. And towards the end of our discussion, we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. But for now, Mariam, I'm going to start with you because one of the solution areas that we highlight in the report as a way to both improve working conditions for paid carers and also to improve the quality of care provision is that of social cooperatives. And with you having founded the Great Care Co-op as Ireland's first carer-owned cooperative, we'd love to hear more about the Great Care Co-op, what motivated you and your co-founder to start it, and what makes it unique. Over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Just let me know how long I have, please. If it's a minute or 30 seconds, makes a difference.
Two or 3 minutes. Yeah, we want to definitely learn a bit about the model.
So it's just about the co-op at the moment. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for having me. Maybe quickly before we start, I just want to give you 3 stats that I want you to keep at the back of your mind. So the first one is that, did you know that over a third of 65-year-olds, as well as over 60% of 85-year-olds live alone in Ireland? That's number one. Secondly, that by 2030, 1 in 6 people around the world and 1 in 5 in Ireland are going to be over 65. And the last one being that in 2020, in Ireland, we had just over 26,000 carers who work with the elderly. That's important to keep at the back of your mind. So the Great Care Co-op was born out of many years of campaigning for workers' rights. A group of us 10 women that had been working in the care sector for a very long time, while we're activists as well with the Migrant Rights Centre Ireland, one of the migrant organizations here in Ireland. 10 of us came together, and we came together because for a very long time throughout our campaigns that we'd worked on, we noticed that the issues that we're campaigning about 10 years ago were still happening today. And we thought, what could we do? Is there something better? We've done this for a very long time. We need to do something differently. And we sat down and we listed the things that don't make us happy at work, about our shifts and all of that. And we also listed the solutions, the potential solutions to them, what we thought would be solutions based on our experience. Between us, we had about 100 years of work experience in the care sector. This is how the Great Care Co-op came together. So in 2018 is when we were registered to have been around, but we started really being operational in 2020, right at the beginning of COVID. We're meant to launch in June that year, I think April or so that year. We ended up moving to June later on. But we've been around for the last 2 years. It's been amazing, a great number of carers as well as people that we provide care to. So that's, a bit about the Great Care Co-op.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for setting the scene with some of those stats from the Irish context and giving us a flavor for how this sort of cooperative can be founded in context. Before we move to our next set of questions, I'd just love to hear a bit more from you about what you think makes the Great Care Co-op different from some of the other models of care provision in the country.
Yeah, so we are not for profit. We are a social enterprise. We are worker-led, worker-owned, and we wanted to make sure that there is a balance between workers being treated well, because we're pro-worker. We come from a workers' rights or inequality background. So that was very important for us. But we also wanted the people that we care for to be well looked after, that their families are working in peace, knowing that they have qualified people, but also people that, provide high quality of care as well as work in a self-managing team, because we felt that sometimes those layers of managers and supervisors do not necessarily always allow the work to happen in the manner that it should happen. Carers know the work. If you're working 10 years in the sector, you know this work, like the back of your hand. So if there's an issue on the ground, why would you need to make 3, 4 phone calls to get that solved when you think you can solve it within the team? So that is how we thought the self-managing teams model would work better, where we deal directly with the families, where carers have each other's support as supervisors and managers to themselves. That's how we feel we're different. That we charge the same as other care organizations and companies, but we pay slightly better. But we also, the main thing is that the workers are at the heart of our work. They have a say in how the co-op is run, how care is provided as well on the ground.
It's really excellent to hear that, you don't necessarily need to compromise this trade-off between the quality of care being provided and placing the workers at the center, giving them that agency to be able to make the decisions in the context where they know what needs to be done best. So I'm going to switch gears now and turn next to you, Ana, because as you may have seen in the report that Helen just presented, we relied very heavily on your work at the OECD, the great data that you and your team have been able to pull together. Can you share with our audience a bit more about the research that you lead on long-term care at the OECD and how it's been harnessed, not just by us, but by others to date?
Thank you. Thank you for having me in the panel, and thank you for that question. Perhaps I'll just start by reminding people what the OECD is. As not everybody might be aware, we're an international organization representing 38 member states. And our work is very much determined by our countries, in the sense that we have every 2 years a program that is designed jointly based on the priorities. So the OECD started working on this topic of long-term care about 20 years ago, but it has really accelerated 10 years ago as aging has become more pressing, where we had a sort of comprehensive publication looking at all the aspects of long-term care, the workforce, but also the family carers, the funding, and trying to also improve value for money. And since then, we've been increasingly asked by countries to look at specific themes. So we've looked at particularly at dementia. We had a publication a few years ago on the care for dementia that became a global priority, with the G7 putting it at the center. Then we've also looked very much at how generous the systems are, because this is a big issue of how countries are financing it, and then how much people have to pay out of their own pockets for the care that they received. And we've also did the work on workforce that you've seen and used for the report. So there we very much wanted to improve the expertise that we had in terms of data, particularly having more knowledge about who were the workers, but also the different policies to address. We've seen in many countries, as you've already said, that given the pressure coming from aging, countries are continuously recruiting workers, but this is not enough given population aging. So it just falls short, and it will continue unless something is done. So we wanted to look at what countries were doing in terms of recruitment, both nationally, but also from foreign-born workers, but particularly in terms of retaining workers, because we think this is also a key issue. You've already mentioned this issue of turnover is very high in the sector. A lot of people leave it as soon as they're there for a short period of time to move on, very often also within the health sector, other sectors that pay better. And this is something that also needs to be addressed, but also productivity. So I don't know if you want me to expand on some of those topics.
Let's leave it there for now and come back to them, but you've just cited quite a number of really essential resources on the topic. So do want to make sure that the audience tuning in has access to those if you are able to share them. I'm going to turn now to you, Ito. Sticking with the research topic for a moment before moving to other areas of this sectoral crossover. You are leading a research project now called Care Economies in Context towards Sustainable Social and Economic Development. And this builds on work that you've done for years at the intersection of care, migration, gender equality, and some of these other areas we touch on in the report. So can you tell us about your current project, where it is in its process, and what some of your findings, from previous projects have been to date?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. As you said, Megan, we just completed our previous 7-year partnership research project called Gender Migration and the Work of Care back in 2020. And we just started this last year, the new project called another 7-year project actually, called Care Economies in Context towards Sustainable Social and Economic Development. Where we are trying to measure and calculate the sizes and shapes of care infrastructures in 9 different countries in 4 global regions, and use that data to develop macroeconomic models of these of care economies in these countries. But we just started last year, so we are still at the early stage yet. What I can tell you is we had a lot of findings from our previous research project that look at the global migration of care workers. So I think what I'll do is give you probably just about 3 key findings that are probably particularly relevant here. Our first finding is that this previous project actually focused on Asia Pacific region, partly because at that time there were not as much research on labor migration, let alone migration of care workers within Asia Pacific regions compared to other regions like Europe or North America. What we learned was that Asia Pacific is, in fact, a really important region because not only is it the largest second largest migration hub after Europe, but it is also the world's largest supplier of foreign healthcare and care workers, and the largest recipients of domestic and care workers. So Asia Pacific is really important because of its huge care migration, and that much of this migration actually happened within the region between countries within Asia Pacific. Our second finding is that of course, demographic change is an important driver of for the demand for care. The reason why there's a huge growing demand for care workers. But one of the key reasons why there's a huge demand for migrant care workers is that care worker, as you said, is largely devalued everywhere because of cultural and institutional biases against care worker as women's work. So wages and working conditions of care workers are poor, which means that local women won't take the job if they have other alternatives. And so that the care work gets downloaded to immigrant women, racialized and status-related women, creating migrant women. And this not only kind of creates and reinforces the pre-existing gender, racial, and status-related inequalities, but also reinforces that culture of devaluing care work. I think it's looking at the intersectional sort of aspect of care work and migration is really important because it really is rooted in that cultural institutional devaluation of care work. I think the third thing, the third finding from our research is that as we move forward, I think countries need to rethink care and care work and to really invest more in care. So this is because, well, first of all, almost every country is going through similar social and economic demographic changes like population aging, low fertility, increased women's employment, which this means that globally there will be continuing increase in demand for care. And secondly, we also know care and service sector economy is now one of the largest and key drivers of employment and economic growth. So countries should consider investing in care and care work as a part of their economic strategy. This means putting more public money to develop care infrastructure and to training and developing human resources in care sector. The multiplier effects of investing in care is huge. It will not only create more jobs in care sector and health sector and other sectors, but it will also address care demands and grow the economy. And as well, it will also create not just direct, but indirect employments as well. So these are 3 main findings from our research. I could say more, but I'll leave it to later.
It's a perfect introduction to the great work you've done over the past several years, and we certainly look forward to learning from this next project's findings. The point you started with about East Asian Pacific as sort of a regional hub, it's definitely top of mind and motivated us to include China as one of the case studies in the report, alongside the UK and the US, understanding especially that within region migratory dynamic. And I look forward to speaking with you all in a minute as we start to look forward about how we can ensure countries, Ito, as you finished on, are starting to recognize the potential of investment in this sector in a way that has been historically, I think, undervalued. So now switching from practice, as Miriam has reflected, to data and research, as Ana and Ito have. Robert, I want to turn to you now on the policy and advocacy side, because at PHI, you are overseeing national advocacy and research to support the care workforce in the United States. Can you tell us about your approach to that work and the impact that you're seeking to have through it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Megan. And I apologize for my voice. I'm managing my first cold in 2 years. And thank you for having me today in today's conversation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with PHI, we are a national organization based in the US that focuses on strengthening the direct care workforce. So we estimate that there are about 4.6 million direct care workers in the US. These are workers who support older adults and people with disabilities in a variety of long-term care settings. They work in private homes, they work in nursing homes, and they work in a vast range of residential care settings like assisted living. We have been around for about 30 years. We emerged from a cooperative, a worker cooperative in the Bronx, New York, that has since become the largest worker cooperative in the US, about 2,000 home care workers supporting each other and really shaping the dialogue on this job sector. For us, the issue around immigration is critical for 3 important reasons. First is that a few years ago, we produced really the first ever research on immigrants in the US who were working in the direct care sector. And we found through our research that about 1 in 4 direct care workers was an immigrant. Now, our research only looks at immigrants who are documented. It doesn't look at undocumented immigrants, where we can imagine even more immigrants are working. But what it told us is that they're a big part of direct care, they're a big part of the long-term care sector, and they're a big part of the US healthcare sector, and they have been for decades. And yet what we know from an equity perspective is that immigrants, for a variety of reasons, are facing additional challenges both in their lives and on the job that make it difficult for them to succeed in these roles. So if we are to strengthen this workforce and support the realities of immigrants in the workforce, we need to think about what are the equity challenges that they're facing and how can we dedicate more attention to that. The other approach into this is from a pipeline perspective. As with other countries, and the report really emphasizes this point, in the US, we are seeing a growing workforce shortage in direct care around the country, and it has become increasingly difficult for employers to find and retain workers, mostly because these jobs don't pay enough and they're not high in quality. And so what we're arguing for is, of course, both improving the quality of these jobs, because all direct care workers deserve good jobs, but also thinking about ways in which we might better support immigrants, both immigrants who are already in the US, but also maybe immigrants from other countries through pathways to the US and through strong workforce protections that ensure that employers are not exploiting immigrants once they are in the US. I do think it's an opportunity for us as a sector to rattle a debate in the US that unfortunately is quite hostile when it comes to immigration. And so if we can think about how do we broaden the argument to one in which we're all thinking about the care that all of us need and deserve and the role that immigrants can play in that, I think it's a nice way to break through that stalemate.
That's excellent. Yeah, and some of the stats that you cite, Robert, I think makes clear that this is not something that can or should be avoided, right? If we're thinking in terms of who is already in our country, who is already doing this valuable work, who needs to be recognized and protected as they're doing it. I really appreciate you shedding light on the US context. Now, understanding the extremely valuable sort of expertise that all of you bring to this conversation, we want to take the opportunity to get your thoughts and reflections on the work that we've done and see if we can improve it and build on it going forward. So a question for all of you, and Ana, maybe we start with you this time and work our way around, is what from the report in terms of our findings and recommendations particularly resonates with you? And what, if anything, would you have wanted us to expand upon or emphasize further?
Thank you, Megan. I would say that many things resonate, definitely. I might start with the less obvious one, given the topic, but what I think is very important, even if it's your last recommendation, is the issue of data. This is really a sector where we lack data. And the OECD, we really try to work on this, but we rely on what countries are actually collecting themselves, and often there is lack of data. And this is really an area where we've seen in the pandemic that has been crucial. The sector has been really hard hit because of COVID. And often countries did not even have data on the number of people who were dying in long-term care institutions, and also linking it with the policies that were undertaking, the number of workers, their qualifications. And it's really important to strengthen this, to try to understand better what is going on in terms of the sector, and also what works and what doesn't work. So that is really something I would like us to just keep in mind. In terms of the recommendations, I think you've really stressed the point that there is an inherent paradox in the sense that we have a high share of foreign-born workers in the sector. And that is probably larger than what we know, because there are many undocumented people. Yet these people get into the sector via other routes. And given the paradox that we are having high demand and many countries are considering it, they have not yet moved to a situation where they actually want to have a target migration, except with the exceptions that you mentioned. And it is, I think, in the pipeline. A lot of countries are considering, but there are concerns. There are always concerns. And that's really something that needs to be well thought as an alternative, because we are facing shortages. The one thing that I think would be interesting to think about is, I mean, you've talked about equal rights and benefits, and that's extremely important. But I would say that this is something that applies to the entire sector, the issue of improving working conditions and pay in the sector, and that. But then making a particular effort for foreign-born who are, as you've mentioned, most likely to suffer from that. I think perhaps what I would also think is important is to see how we can also look at migration in both ways, because now we are seeing many countries in Europe, for instance, where they also face high immigration from care workers that are moving to other countries because of the better pay. At the same time, they're already starting to face shortages themselves. So how can it be done that migration can be encouraged for the countries that are in need, but that we can also find some channels to encourage the return migration to the countries, particularly with some sort of recognition of the experience and the acquisition of the learning, so that people can return into higher positions and they can have the incentive to go back, probably with other additional incentives. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, great to know that the data recommendation hits home, and this last point you made about the incentive structures to encourage return migration, I think we hope can certainly sort of sweeten the deal and encourage countries going forward to ensure that there's going to be sort of a win-win dynamic, so long as those types of dimensions are considered. Ito, why don't we turn to you next? Your reflections on the report.
Okay, sure. Oh, well, first of all, I like the reports. I like the report very much. I like its aim to highlight the contributions of the care workers and migrant care workers, and its attempt to point out some of the realities and challenges faced by care workers, and in particular migrant care workers, and sort of attempt to develop more effective and sustainable solutions to provide care for people. I have just a few sort of suggestions and ideas. One actually follows on Anna's point about the need for more data. And I just want to sort of, not to repeat her point, but to emphasize that, one of the challenges in data collection is that many of the care workers, and for example, in Asia Pacific context, domestic workers do a lot of care work, and many of these domestic workers, their statistics and data are hard to collect because they're invisible. They're employed within private homes. We have, some countries have the data about them, other countries don't. We have, so it is very difficult to identify how many are there, who are there, what their working conditions like. So I think much better data collection is needed, but we also need to be very mindful that some data are very difficult to collect, and we have to find more effective strategies to learn more about these people. I think pipeline concern is absolutely an important issue. I think we need to ensure that these pipelines as a strategy also is safe and ethical in the process. So I wanted to point out, I think I agree with the key message of the report, and I think the emphasis on recognizing and revaluing care work is really important. I also think the point about making long-term care and other care sectors more attractive for local workers is really, really important. I think that would require, again, local and national investment in care and care work. And I agree that I'm not against migration of care workers, actually, but and I agree that in the short and long-term recruiting migrant care workers may seem to be the only solutions for many countries, particularly in sort of high-income countries. But I also think that it would be really important to remember that many of the sending countries are also aging as well. Countries like Philippines, many African countries and Southeast Asian countries, they are also aging as well. So we really cannot depend, and I think we shouldn't depend on migrant workers to solve the care work shortages in the long run. I think we need multi-pronged strategies to address sort of this issue. And one of the strategies is really ensuring that we increase the supply of care workers. And the way to increase that is really recognizing, revaluing, and investing in care and care work. Could I just say one more thing? And that is, I think we also need to think of care worker migration, not just between countries, but within countries as well. So a good example is China. There's something like over 3 million migrant workers, and within countries. And in the case of, we have done research in China, and where huge number of, what we call Hukou people, the rural to urban migrant workers, many of those women end up working as long-term care workers or personal care workers for older people. And I think this is similar in many Latin American countries as well. So I think we need to think of it not just between country issue, but within country and also global issue.
It's a great point. Thank you so much for flagging, and I hope we have done justice to it in the China case study as well, for those of you interested in diving deeper on that one. Next, I'm going to turn to Robert and then Mariam for their reflections and recommendations on the report.
Thanks, Megan. I would certainly underscore my panelists' comments that the report is excellent. I think it's a really strong kind of overview of the challenges that many countries are facing. And for the US, it really mirrors, I think, the challenges and the opportunities that we're seeing when it comes to immigrants in the direct care workforce. Data is a big issue for us in the US. Most states in the US do not collect basic data on direct care workers. We can estimate the size of the workforce, we can look at demographics, but we can't look at issues such as turnover rates, vacancy rates, compensation, the kind of real challenges that many states are facing in the US, and that's prevented from a data and research perspective. I also think the report underscores the 2 points around the challenges of growing demand and workforce shortages and the equity issues that immigrants are facing that make it difficult for them to succeed in these roles and to live in this country. I would emphasize 2 points that I think the report speaks to or hints at. One is that I do think there is a tension in the US between how do we kind of create equitable jobs for direct care workers that are strong in terms of compensation and training opportunities that really provide a way for any worker in the US to succeed in these roles. But also, how do we create a pipeline from other countries in ways that when workers do enter the country, that they're able to stay in this country if it's something that they want to do, but it's also something that if they choose not to, they can go back to their country and they're not exploited in the meantime. And I think that being able to reconcile both dynamics of creating a quality job for all US workers that would be appealing to anyone, regardless of their country of origin, and also creating a pipeline so that immigrants are protected as they enter the country and work in these jobs. I think that that's a big tension that exists in the US and might be existing in other parts of the country. I also think that in the US, I mentioned this earlier, there is a hysteria around immigration that makes it difficult for people at the federal level especially to talk about these kinds of solutions, because it's so often bound in these ideas that immigrants are threats to the US, that immigrants are criminals, that we need to create stronger borders. That's at least what certain parts of our federal government will say. And I think that that's important for us as we think about solutions. How do we kind of break through the misrepresentations of immigrants and the ideas that are really preventing people in long-term care from developing solutions that would make care available for all of us and make good jobs available for all workers? I think the reports are hinting at some of those pieces, but I think it's a big piece in the US context.
A need to engage with that narrative while we're also engaging with the substantive policy reforms that are going to better protect workers. It's a great point. Mary, I'm going to give you the last word on this front. Any particular reflections on the findings that Helen has presented or that others have raised so far?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was looking at the for key findings, I just thought, what is new there, and obviously this is not to say that this research was not necessary. No, it meant that we've had this so much and we've lived this so much. The increasing demand for care, and with us here, if it wasn't for COVID, and we wouldn't even have something like a regularization program that we have right now that the country announced after 11 years of lobbying for a lot of care workers to be regularized. A lot of undocumented migrants in Ireland. I think the Migrant Rights Center did their research and showed that over 50% worked in the care sector, and for so many years it meant that we campaigned for regularization. And after 11 years, COVID came, and then the minister looked into that. So we welcome that very much, because it means that people can begin to move out of the shadows and be able to visit their relatives they haven't seen as well for like 20 years. This is the first time in the past 25 years that we have migration in Ireland, in the sense that we understand migration today. Essential workers, again, during COVID, this came so to the fore, and everyone was surprised that, we've always said care workers are essential workers, but it only emerged around that time that we really needed to look after them. People, for example, people that needed to be vaccinated if they were undocumented, and a lot of people in care homes. Again, there's a significant number of undocumented workers in the care homes, absolutely essential workers. Therefore, there was a need from so long ago to regularize, but also, get people work permits. And pathways to migration, really, really important. Because we know migration pathway means that it sort of determines how much access you have to services and everything else. And that really there is a need to look at, as Ito mentioned there about the countries where people come from as well, that we like now we've announced this big recruitment drive that we're going to get nurses targeting specific countries, African and Asian countries. Already we had a high percentage of Asian, say, nurses from their home countries that have become care workers here, or they are now nurses, entry-level nurses here. But what does that mean for the countries where they live? Is there a way that we can give back to those countries? Because training and the aging populations around the world, as you've stated, but cared for there. And what does it mean also for people to live? Yes, money is important to live, but also, for example, I'm from South Africa. I haven't been home in 5 years, and I keep thinking about my grandmother, that how I wish I could give her the same care that I give people here. That everyone deserves that, but it's just not always possible. So finding a way to keep that sustainable and looking at the less well-off parts of the world. I think funding is a very big thing when you're thinking about, supporting groups that are carers. A lot of the times, like the work that we were able to do setting up the COP was because we were funded by the European Social Fund. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do that. So it is important to look into initiatives like this where care workers can be looked after better. I think that's really everything you've said. The recommendations amazing. Recognition of qualifications. I do not see why and how people need to start from scratch to retrain. They might be coming with a degree already or training in the sector and experience, but we want them to be trained here in Europe, for example, or in Ireland. Why is that the case? Why are other qualifications inferior? And why do we make it so difficult for people to be able to just progress in the sectors they work in?
Thanks so much, Mariam. And I'm particularly appreciative and encouraged that what we have raised as words on paper resonate with your experience sort of on the front lines of delivering care, especially having come from South Africa to Ireland to do the great work that you're doing. With that, I'm going to keep Mariam as the last word, because I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time to turn to our co-author and the project lead for this report, Claire Kumar from ODI, who's going to wrap us up with her reflections and closing remarks. Just before passing to Claire, I want to say one final thank you to all four of you. A very rich discussion that I wish we had even more time for, but really look forward to following up and brainstorming together how we can continue to work on this agenda collaboratively. So thank you all, and Claire, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Megan. And also just to echo your words there, I just want to also say a massive thank you to the fantastic panel that we have. I think we've almost got the ideal lineup here today, and it's been great to listen to all these different perspectives. And thank you, Megan, for your moderation, of course, and to the whole CGD team for the smooth event, but also for the lovely experience working together over the last year, which has been great as well from my perspective. And so, yes, reflections. I mean, I think my first sort of main one is just I mean, very personal and from the heart, I'm so glad that we looked at this issue. I am more convinced than ever about the scale of this challenge and the priority that it should have. I mean, all of the speakers talked about this, the issues with the shortages, many countries literally facing crisis in this sector, and it's very significant in the UK right now. So I think the sheer importance of this issue is just fundamental. And I think one of the things that surprised me in the research was just the actual economic importance of the sector, which I know Ito has talked about and obviously is a core part of her research, because that is something that I think a lot of us miss. It is such a critical, such a critical sector in terms of the size of the workforce, the number of jobs, and its contribution to the functioning of any economy. So I just really think we need to keep that at the center of our mind. I think also just to sort of conclude on some of the implications of this in terms of what should we take away, what should we be focusing on. I think the panel have covered so many different issues that it's maybe hard to wrap that up. But I think one of the things is just how much this cuts across different communities and different sort of policy areas. And obviously people have talked about that. But I think it's important to just mention from the perspective of, say, social policy and the public policy community, there's already, I think, a very high concern about the long-term care sector. And obviously people like Robert, who have been working on this for years, have talked about the advocacy and policy work that's being done. And Ito was very clear about the need to rethink care and care work and the care economy, invest in it, professionalize it. This, there are issues around access and policy design. There's issues around financing. I think that policy community is incredibly advanced in its thinking and in its suggestions. Where I feel we have a bit more neglect, perhaps, if that's the right term to use, is really in the migration community. We don't have the experience of the legal pathways. We know we need them. We know that this is something countries are considering. As Anna said, they're cautious, there's concerns. And obviously there should be, because this is a quite an exploited, undervalued workforce. So we need to be very careful with how we go about this, how we manage migration in an ethical and sustainable way. And I'm really glad that that has come out as a sort of key message. But I do think, going back to the shortages, the scale of the crisis that everyone has mentioned, I do think we need to look at it, and we need to really seriously look at the design of those kind of migration policies. And here, I think the issue of neglect is it's really a question also for the development community and the public health community. And that's something obviously we look at in the report. How can the WHO Global Code of Practice in terms of international sustainable recruitment, how can that be applied to care workers? And I do think that is a very, very critical question. And here, I think there needs to be a lot more done to get this issue on the agenda and to deal with it from the perspective that Ito very glad that she brought this up, the rapid aging in countries of origin as well. We need to develop projects that aim to increase the supply of care workers, both in origin countries and, of course, from the perspective of migration to high-income countries. And we can do that. It's possible, of course, to have projects that are mutually beneficial and seek to build the long-term care workforce in other countries at the same time. So I think there are lots of opportunities here. But one thing I just want to say, my last word, I promise, Megan, is just the issue of the characterization of these jobs as low-skilled. And I think Robert, made this very clear, so did other speakers, of course. We need to improve the quality of these jobs. And actually, the low-skilled classification is extremely problematic in migration policy terms. It's extremely problematic in terms of the valuation and devaluation of these workers and the pay and conditions that they work under. But also, actually, I think it's completely misaligned with the reality of care work. And I say this particularly because of dementia. And I know that Anna brought this up as a key concern and area of focus for them. We are looking at increasingly chronic, complex conditions. We really need to evolve our consideration of skill and the skill level of this job. And I think that, to me, is where the policy win-win really sits. Because if we can do that, we benefit workers. We will change our whole interpretation of this from a migration policy perspective. And of course, it is what will enable us to professionalize the sector, to have proper recognition of experience, credentials, qualifications. And that is what will make ethical migration a reality. I think that's the hook that we need for this to function. So for all, I'm sure many people out there know a lot more about the care sector than we do, but really my last call would simply be around that skilled classification, that for once and for all, we really do need to move on from this misalignment that really has so many negative implications. And I think, Megan, I can hand back to you on the dot of 4 p.m, I hope. Thank you so much for everyone's words today and all of your kind words about the report, and to the CGD team for a lovely research project.
Thank you, Claire. A really powerful point to end on, to underscore the essential, invaluable nature of this work and the workers performing it. Thank you all. We're signing off.